In ancient times, the philosopher Aristotle noticed a pattern in stories that they typically ran one of two ways, and both ways had some sort of psychological or societal benefit. He studied plays. 2,000 years later, Northrop Frye, a Canadian PhD in English literature, picked up the torch and elaborated on the theory, adding two more genres. I made a short about the 4 genres of Northrop Frye's theory from Anatomy of Criticism, and today I'm going to narrow down on one. But if you didn't check out that short, I'll go over all 4 real quick right now. Here they are. We have these 4. The comedy, which we will talk about in depth today, which has to do with community reintegration. Doesn't necessarily have to be funny, and in fact, typically it's not. Then there's the irony, which is the opposite of the romance. It's an unworthy quest or a flat character arc. Whereas the comedy has, they start okay, things go poorly, and then at the end, things get better. The tragedy is the comedy upside down. Things start off, then they get better and better, and then the fall of the great man. Things end up terrible, typically ends in the death of the protagonist. The romance is the journey story. It's a worthy quest that is achieved. Think of the knight's story. Okay, now let's move on to the comedy. To confuse terms further, the types of stories we tell in modern times that most match up with the comic arc tend to be romance stories. So here's what Northrop Frye and to an extent Aristotle means when they say the word comedy. You have a man and woman who meet, and there's pretty much instantaneous desire. Very unrealistic. Love at first sight is actually quite rare, but they're definitely attracted by the first meeting. Then their desire is thwarted, usually by a parent or what we call a blocking character, which I'll get to soon. And Northrop Frye says, by the end, some twist allows them to reunite. During my university education, I learned a book that followed this structure pretty much to a T. And we also studied it in the context of Northrop Frye's theory of the comic story arc. So it was called Kyrios and Clairway, and the author was called Cariton. Good luck pronouncing that. So basically, the premise of the story is that you have 2 characters, and they meet, they fall in love. I think it's the eve before the wedding, and they get separated. I don't remember if the parents were against it, but a lot of people were against it. There were a series of blocking characters in that story, and basically she gets kidnapped by pirates. We can jump into symbolism briefly. Pirates symbolize chaos because they are outside of the regular societal order. So, and on top of that, they sail on the seas, which are chaotic. They are nature, right? The chaos of nature. So pirates are actually kind of like a double chaos symbol. From there, she gets shipped off from ruler to ruler who see her beauty and they want to like marry her instead. And I don't remember exactly. It's been a long time, but I think she stands up for herself to an extent, but basically convenience and external elements end up saving her from these people. Now, that's actually a theme in older writing, is that a lot of things happen externally, and the characters tend to have a lot less agency. In this particular novel, the main characters basically do not make any of the important moves, but they are the main characters because we are nonetheless rooting for them to reunite. It's interesting. I think that the ancient world had a much smaller view of what was in human control, and actually some philosophies such as Stoicism believed that we controlled almost nothing about our lives, and they actually would use things like the movement of the stars and the interpretation of them to see exactly what their fate was, and then rather than fight it, accept it, which is kind of the opposite of what we see in modern narratives. You think of like one of the taglines of the Disney film Brave was to change her fate, right? So Northrop Frye contrasts the beginning society and the ending society. Oh, where's my pointer? Okay, so the old society is represented by the blocking characters, and it is rote and rigid. It is, maybe it once worked, but whatever version is encapsulated in the mind of the blocking characters is like some sort of outdated, corrupt version. Not that the characters are corrupt, but they're the way they see the world, I guess, is. So it's characterized by habit, bondage, arbitrary laws of the old society. The blocking characters are typically older and rigid, and they are in control. They represent an absurd version of the past. So let's talk about blocking characters. They are typically an authority figure, a parent. They represent a corrupted version of society, which has become rigid, arbitrary, and absurd. I went over that. And in the comic ending, these characters are not condemned. Their absurd ideas are. This is important. Sometimes we watch a film where the villains aren't that villainous, and yet because the standard in Hollywood is that the bad guys must die, they end up being killed. And sometimes it's weird and uncomfortable. It's like, they didn't do anything bad. They just had, outdated opinions, or they were antagonistic but not evil. They didn't have to die. And it feels a little uncomfortable. Well, the ancient comic arc, the ancient comedy stories, didn't have this issue. Typically, the villain showed up to the party and, they kind of wore their sheepish grin and were like, oh, sorry. Funnily enough, like, Dragon Ball Z kind of does this in a weird way where a lot of the main heroes were once villains. Think Piccolo or Vegeta. So, there's dating myself a little bit, but that's an interesting point. I think another example is you have, like, I believe Ella Enchanted ends with a party, and we're going to get to the ending party. Big song and dance. A lot of these, like, romance stories for young people will end in a big celebration, a song and dance. And sometimes we see the villains. Sometimes they do show up to the party. And sometimes they get like one last gag where like the pie falls on their head or something, and we all get to laugh. So they don't end up defeated. They end up kind of lampooned. And so what they represent is defeated, I guess. If we think of the modern rom-com, which follows its very rigid structures, we see that the blocking thing is typically in the mind. And it's almost as if the authority in modern society, the only authority or the main authority that we consider is ourselves, which is ironic, but it's incredibly modernist. I think it's kind of appropriate. So typically it's some sort of misunderstanding between the lovers, or some sort of secret is revealed. One of the greatest, I'm so happy that it's an archetypal example of these sorts of themes because it's such a terrific one. Shrek, right? The misunderstanding where Shrek overhears Fiona talking about this ugly creature and how negatively she feels about it. And we, the audience, know that she's talking about herself, but Shrek doesn't know that. He thinks she is talking about him because he's the ogre. Little does Shrek know that she also turns into an ogre. So that is misunderstanding. That is, the blocking character is actually a blocking thought. The other thing is the secret, which Shrek also has. Fiona has this secret. So there you go. I added a wonderful little section here for what we're talking about. The misunderstanding, the secret. So Fiona has a secret. Shrek also has a secret that basically he was on this quest for Lord Farquaad and not for himself. I don't know if it's a secret, but I think it does end up causing drama. Forgive me if I messed that up. Another great example, after the Shrek example, I will tell you another great example that actually follows the older themes, but is a more recent film. And by recent, I mean like of my generation. It probably came out like 10 or 20 years ago. The final thing that is a blocking factor, and this one is external, is the love triangle or multiple suitors. But if you think about it, it's not external either. It's internal. The protagonist is stuck choosing between multiple suitors. And there's actually one that I left out of here, which is it's called the enemies to lovers trope, where the blocking character is actually the other character. It's the love interest themselves. So again, due to some sort of twist, and often it was quite arbitrary in ancient stories, the lovers are allowed to reunite. And this ends with us being in the renewed society. So in my bibliography, I checked out two different sources. The Anatomy of Criticism, obviously. My university experience with, I had two professors who talked about this, a Dr. Fagan and a Dr. Jurgens. And then here we have Robert D. Denham, his website, where he talks about it. And here's the URL if you're interested. So back to here. The Renewed Society. In the website, Denham argues that basically Fry sees this as similar in some strange way to Aristotle's 5 proofs for legal discussion. But basically, the old society is an opinion or an illusion, and the renewed society is proven to be the truth. So it's almost like in a legal case, you have one idea of how things went, and then throughout the case, you get the evidence, and eventually what's proven is not the arbitrary law, but the pragmatic freedom symbolized by the younger generation. Okay, let's get a little more grounded again. So, the renewed society is what happens at the end. We have pragmatic freedom, freedom from a rigid illusion to reality. A reality that includes the input of the next generation. So the comic story, the community reintegration story, is a little bit of a generational tale, or actually it's a lot of a generational tale. And I think the fact that we've lost the blocking characters and moved on to internal factors is a bit of a loss of this generational story that used to be told. The ending shows an ideal, often the opposite of what the absurd illusion, the opposite of the absurd illusion the blocking characters held. So I think that's pretty interesting. In ancient Greece, the plays that used to be put on were basically living essays. It was like, we have this idea, we have this theory of how life is, and we're going to act it out. And the audience received some sort of enjoyment or education or catharsis depending on what they saw. Interestingly, the thesis of the argument of an ancient Greek play was already known to the audience. And what I mean by that is ancient Greek plays typically retold existing myths. So everybody already knew the ending and basically the entire story, and they went out into the theater to see it lived out, to see the playwright's version of it. It's interesting. It's a completely different approach, but we actually live that way now with, for example, genre fiction. When people go to read a romance book or watch a rom-com, they're expecting some of this stuff every single time. And when, for whatever reason, the lovers separate over some small misunderstanding, we don't say, hey, that's dumb. They should just have a 5-minute conversation like adults and clear it up. We don't typically do that unless we aren't used to the genre. Instead, we say, well, We say nothing. We go along with it because that is the genre expectation. So this impulse in humanity has existed for millennia, probably since, society started. So let's get to the comic conclusion. A key aspect of the ending of a comedy is the celebration, and it's typically a wedding between the two characters who were separated. It involves reintegration of the protagonist into society. I recently finished a novel that I was reading for research, and basically the question was, they lived in separate states, and so the question was, how are they going to integrate their lives if they live in separate places and they work separate jobs? What ended up happening was the male love interest bought the store across the street from the female love interest and moved there. Very funny, but it's literally he integrated himself into her society in a natural way. This was set up at the beginning of the novel where it was said that the shop across the street has been for sale forever. Opportunity fulfilled. Typically, one thing we like in stories in general is we actually don't like sudden surprises. What is most satisfying is when we are expecting a certain outcome and we get it, but in a different way than we expected. If we get exactly it, then we might get a little bored. But in this case, there was already a space for him to move in. The place across the street was for sale. The thing I've been saying over and over again, the reintegration of the protagonist into the society itself is renewed in order to accommodate them, hence what we were talking about before. The blocking characters are usually also integrated. They have, quote, learned their lesson and discarded their old beliefs. So this is huge. Again, I've said it's forgotten, but it's important that typically the bad guys, quote unquote bad guys, show up to the party. Why? Well, if they're the parents, they are still the parents. So they have to come around to the perspective of the main characters, and it kind of symbolizes society and the entire previous generation coming around to accepting the input of the new generation. I know you can see me moving my pen in the shadow here. Implicit is an idea of a past golden age which the newly reunified community embodies or symbolizes. So this is a really interesting idea, and I don't think it would fly in modern society, but it works on a psychological level nonetheless. Let me explain. The modern worldview tends to reject ideas like an ancient golden age that we must return to. In fact, modernism as a movement that began a little over 100, maybe 150-ish years ago, at the turn of the 1900s, basically found that the old narratives, the old beliefs were wrong, and it was up to us to create our own beliefs and even our own values. Did that premise work out? The answer is probably not. World War I and II basically shattered the modernist ideal and the modernist optimism. Okay, cool. I cut off my own camera there. So World War I and II really shattered the modernist optimism. I think a great example of a highly optimistic modernist project would be Disney World. And actually, film and animation itself are very modernist forms of art, in my opinion. But I think Disney World is like, he created a whole new optimistic world to make people happy, and it's kind of completely fabricated. And what I mean that like literally, like it's built by human hands. It's not like a water park that's built into the side of a mountain, and the mountain is, part of nature, and it ends up in the lake, which is, again, a natural formation. Disney World is completely constructed. Modernism was an interesting movement. There's discussion whether or not postmodernism is kind of the same as modernism. I think there are some distinctions, and one is that that optimism is kind of lost. But again, that's a discussion for another video. Let's get back to our topic. I was talking about the implicit idea of a past golden age, which the newly reunified community embodies or symbolizes. This is almost an example of like innate expectations, innate knowledge, or conscience to an extent. The comic genre, which is one of the most common genres across time, presupposes reader or viewer, audience knowledge. When something goes wrong with the characters, when they're confronted with the arbitrary law of the blocking characters, then we immediately sense, oh, there's something wrong here. They should not be wholesale blocking the characters. They should be giving the younger protagonists autonomy to choose their own mates, and there is still a place for the parents in that they have wisdom and experience, and they should be using that to help inform the decision of the protagonists rather than making the decision for them. But I still haven't really spoken of this golden age thing. This has actually been explored in academic or scholarly writing from like 100 years ago. I think in like, not exactly the golden bough, but that sort of genre of thinking. That it's funny, I learned about this in my Canadian literature, but it's been so long I can't remember it. What I recognize is that there are kind of two worldviews. One that sees the golden age in the past, and one that sees the golden age in the future. And it's very funny. I don't mean to get political here, but you can think of conservatives see the golden age in the past, and they're always trying to return to the golden age, and they'll talk of past documents or movements such as the founding fathers, the Constitution, past. And then liberals are on the other end of things. They're like, the golden age is in the future. We're gonna come up with some sort of utopia where everybody is equal, and we have ideas of what that looks like and what that is going to feel like and how to get there even. And both of them are kind of wrong. I think the reality is probably a bit of both. I think that there were golden ages in the past, and they can inform us as we move towards a golden age in the future, so to speak. I am incredibly wary of utopian visions, but I do believe that things can be better than they are now. Think of the Renaissance. One of the movements of the Renaissance was, we can see that over the past few centuries, things have gotten better. Humanity has increased in technology and prosperity. Even to this day, the planet can now support more people than it ever was able to because of advances in agriculture and food production technology. So the Renaissance idea was that because we saw progress in the past, we can continue that progress into the future. I think that's a much more interesting way to think of things. And it was successful. The Renaissance is one of the most famous, successful historical movements, and it moved not just one country. It didn't just move Italy, but it spread across all of Europe and maybe even outside of Europe. So this notion of a past golden age is pretty big. This is a huge historical topic, and it's an old way of viewing the world that we don't talk about much anymore. But there was huge discussion on it 100 years ago and probably even further back. And the comic story presupposes that we have some sort of idea of this embedded in us. And I compare it to the notion of conscience. When the blocking characters are doing things like getting stuck in habitual bonded habit, arbitrary law, getting rigid, outdated, stuck in their ways, something within us picks up on that and sees it as wrong, and the conclusion rectifies that and fixes it. So I'm going to end on a quote by Northrop Frye himself. He says, "The audience simply understands an ideal state of affairs which it knows to be better than what is revealed in the play or story, and which it recognizes as like that to which the action leads." That is the comic story. So if that interested you, support this sort of content by liking, commenting, subscribing if you want more, and maybe give some ideas for what sorts of videos you'd like to see next. There are 3 other genres that I will eventually have to cover, but maybe you're interested in something else. I do literary analysis. I look into personality types and personality science, which is based on traits, not types, and I write my own novels. So if you check out my website, you might be able to find my progress on those. At this time, nothing is released, but if you watch this in a few months, there should be 1 or 2 ready to be read.